Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you to this panel discussion on practicing refugee law on the frontier. And in this case, the frontier that we'll be considering includes Egypt, Malaysia, India, and Hong Kong. The event is organized by the Center for Comparative and Public Law in the Faculty of Law at Hong Kong U, the Human Rights Hub within the center, and also the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York. I'm very pleased to introduce Martin Jones and welcome him back to Hong Kong U. He's certainly no stranger to us here in Hong Kong. He's visited Hong Kong many times to advise the government and civil society organizations. In the last few years, we've been very lucky to have him come and teach an annual course on international refugee law as part of our LLM and human rights program in the faculty. Martin is a senior lecturer at the University of York, and he's here with his very impressive research team of lawyers who are truly practicing on the frontier and will share some of the challenges that they face, as well as the opportunities in some particularly difficult contexts. Martin himself was a former refugee lawyer in Canada and has been a pioneer as both a leading scholar in the field as well as a practitioner in exploring and testing the boundaries of refugee law, including many of the assumptions that we hear quite often about refugee law in many ways. His current major research project, which is funded by the UK Economic Social Research Council, has brought together this group sitting here, as well as several others who have joined us from the floor, to examine processes of legal engagement or legal encounters with the law of asylum in the 4 frontier jurisdictions in the Middle East and Asia. So I'll now pass the floor to Martin, who will properly introduce his team and his project and also moderate the discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. It's very nice to be back here in Hong Kong, albeit at a slightly more temperate time of the year. But from a childhood in Vancouver and a decade now in England, this feels like home. So apologies for bringing the cold, damp weather with me. The panel, as Kelly said, arises out of work that she and I and a group of others, to whom I'll shortly introduce you to, have been doing work we've been doing on refugee protection in the Middle East and Asia. And despite a majority of the world's refugees being located in these 2 regions, there's been precious little academic discussion of their place in the international refugee regime, and too little attention to the amazing work of local legal practitioners who are finding avenues for the protection of refugees. Our visit to Hong Kong and this panel discussion are a small step towards addressing this lack of discussion and attention. So in keeping with the theme of discussion, the panel today is planned as a bit of a question and answer. First, I'll be asking some questions of the panelists, and then I'll open it up to the floor for a more general discussion. But before we begin, I'd like to say a few words of background about both the international refugee regime and refugee law, and also being a refugee lawyer. With respect to the international refugee regime, the Middle East and Asia are often viewed as zones of exception to the regime, a view that is most commonly supported by the proposition that states of these regions have rejected refugee law, or that the rule of law is to weaken these regions to provide protection. The result of this rejection is that refugees in these regions are perceived to live, using the memorable phrase of a refugee from Egypt, in the state of UNHCR. And they're forced to rely upon the international refugee regime, primarily the good offices of UNHCR, for protection. And I think if there's one message that you should take home from this panel, is that this perception is both a limiting and a dangerous fantasy. Now, there's something that is at least superficially different about the Middle East and Asia. It's true. While 3/4 of the states in the world, 147 states, have become party to the core treaties of the refugee regime, in particular the Convention relating to the status of refugees of 1951, the majority of states in these 2 regions are the exception and have not become party. Geographically, to put it in very concrete terms, you can travel from Lebanon to the final islands of the archipelago of Indonesia without passing through a state that is party to the Refugee Convention. What this means is 9 million of the world's 17 million refugees live there in these places to which the Refugee Convention does not apply. But what it means to reject refugee law is tied up with how we understand the meaning of that term. While the Refugee Convention sets important international standards, could refugee law be more than simply the Refugee Convention? Does rejecting, or at least not signing the Refugee Convention, mean that the law has nothing to say about the protection of refugees? Could it be that a larger collection of laws, legal principles, and legal arguments can support an individual who's forced to flee abroad, even without the Refugee Convention? I think you know where I'm going with the answers to these questions. Examples from the Middle East and Asia suggest that we need to broaden our understanding of what refugee law is, and also what is required of legal systems in order for it to provide avenues to protection. To take an example, India hasn't become a party to the Refugee Convention, and yet there's a case pending before its Supreme Court today for it to determine the legality of its policy to deport Rohingyas from the country. That litigation is based upon the constitutional principles of equality and non-discrimination, and the long-standing recognition in international law beyond the Refugee Convention of the principle of non-refoulement. Closer to home here in Hong Kong, litigation before the courts has been based upon other legal norms, ranging from international human rights guarantees to provisions in the Basic Law to common law principles of fairness. Beginning with the 2004 Court of Final Appeal decision in Prabhakar, lawyers, including Mark Daly and his colleagues, have forced the government to offer protection to individuals seeking asylum, including through the Unified Screening Mechanism. Nor need difficulties with the rule of law be a barrier to the protection of refugees through the law. In Egypt, where you'll hear from Mohammed in a few minutes, in Egypt, which ranks 110th out of 113 states in the World Justice Project's new 2018 Rule of Law Index, lawyers for the Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights nonetheless have a success rate of more than 90%. Even in Malaysia, which suffers both from not being a party to the Refugee Convention and threats to the rule of law, important victories have been won recognizing the workplace rights of undocumented migrants and restricting the punishment of refugees for Immigration Act violations. In short, the perception that there is no refugee law in the Middle East and Asia is misguided and belied by the success of lawyers, including many of the ones that you'll hear from today. And I'd suggest that it arises from more than simply a narrowness in the definition of refugee law. It isn't simply a matter of thinking that refugee law is only the Refugee Convention. Rather, it arises from a more deeply problematic legal Orientalism that cannot see in its gaze on these regions the many ways that the law can and does offer protection. It too quickly skips over the often informal legal encounters pursued by lawyers on behalf of refugees in which their rights are secured, or at least through which their treatment is improved. And just to be clear, all of this isn't about finding work for lawyers, although there's much work for lawyers to be done and many lawyers needed. It's also about proposing alternatives to the flawed ad hoc political negotiations that compromise the rights of refugees and push them further from protection in these regions. Alternatives that are too often pursued only at the international level between international actors. Now, turning to the issue of being a refugee lawyer, I don't want to tell you about being a refugee lawyer working at the frontier, because we have a panel full of lawyers who are that and who can tell you in much better terms than I can about that experience. But what I do want to do before I begin the questions is provide a bit of context for the work beyond what I've said about the refugee regime. There's a bigger context I think is important to say just a few words about at the start. Lawyers working on behalf of refugees are many things, including human rights defenders, people who act to promote or protect human rights. The activities of human rights defenders are increasingly conducted in repressive environments. In much of the world, they face interference in their activities, criminalization of their works, and threats and acts of violence. The struggle of human rights defenders against this shrinking space for civil society has been described by the UN as an epic struggle that could shape the course of our world for generations to come. and by prominent civil society organizations as a tectonic shift that now threatens the relevance and viability of civil society. It feels strange to have to say these words in Hong Kong. I think they're particularly relevant here. But why I'm saying this is because the risks faced by human rights offenders working with refugees is also of great concern and is the subject of an upcoming report by the UN Special Rapporteur, who visited here last June, I think, and gave a presentation from this very table. And he is tabling a report in March before the Human Rights Council that will remind us of many of the challenges that face lawyers and other human rights offenders working with refugees. To quote the upcoming report, "The challenges faced by human rights offenders cannot be separated from the challenges faced by those whose rights they defend, not least because many of the latter are also the former. Just as people on the move too frequently face policies designed to create a hostile environment, so too do defenders acting in solidarity with and advocating for the rights of the people on the move face a growing number of restrictions and controls. These challenges dangerously reinforce each other, leading to a downward spiral of further marginalization and greater obstacles to the effective exercise of their rights." I mean, let me be blunt. The individuals on this stage and their colleagues in the audience and elsewhere have been threatened with physical violence. Their families have been threatened. They worry about being arrested and prosecuted for their activities as lawyers. Their ability to access international funding to support their work has been restricted, and the list goes on. Their clients face similar and greater hostility when they seek to complain about their mistreatment or pursue a remedy. I think this broader context makes the work of refugee lawyers like the ones before you and their colleagues both more remarkable and even more important. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists and begin the discussion. So on the panel, as Kelly said, we have refugee lawyers from Egypt, India, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. And I guess working my way across the panel from right next to me, we have Hamza Vijayarajavan from the IRA Trust in Delhi. We have Sumita Shantini from the North-South Initiative in Malaysia. We have Brunner Servant from here in Hong Kong from Daly Ho & Associates. And at the end, we have Mohammed Farhat from the Egyptian Foundation of Refugee Rights, for refugee rights in Egypt. So let me begin with just a general question, I suppose, to all of you, which is to tell me a little bit and tell us a little bit about the organizations you come from and the work that they do for refugees. Perhaps we could begin with you, Hamza.
Hello, good afternoon. Apologies, my throat is really bad, so I might sound really unpleasant at different points in this conversation, but it's not intentional. So I work for the IRA Trust, which is an organization working on refugee rights in New Delhi in India. We set up in early 2013, so we are almost 5 years old now, which is by all standards a young organization, but the only one in India to do the kind of work that we do, which is primarily to provide legal representation in the asylum process. I'm not sure I can talk about the organization without giving a little bit of context on the situation in India. So we have about 200,000 refugees in India, at least on paper. And they are divided into, it's a dual regime for refugee protection, so to speak. So the government sort of manages the population from countries like Tibet and Sri Lanka. So neighboring countries, so to speak, Pakistan as well, we have a few refugees from there. And the non-neighboring countries and Myanmar, which is a neighboring country, is managed by UNHCR. So UNHCR has about 40,000 persons of concern under its mandate, and the Indian government has the rest. We haven't signed the Refugee Convention. We don't have any kind of domestic laws on refugees or refugee protection. So it's a bit of a legal black hole that we work in. And IRA is the only organization that does any kind of legal work with refugees in India. So in the past few years, we have realized that just doing status determination assistance is not enough, because refugees do manage to get status with UNHCR, but then sort of fall into a hole where they don't know whether they can work or access schools or healthcare. So we've recently started doing some work on access to services as well. We are starting out with research, so finding out the extent of their access right now to health, education, documentation, financial inclusion, banking, insurance, anything that the average resident of a country would have access to. And we are hoping to take this further in the next few years. So actually do some advocacy around these areas as well. And we're just about launching a few projects for livelihood as well. So in a nutshell, that's what we do at the IRA Trust. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sumita. North-South Initiative, I'm a committee member there, and it's an NGO working on grassroots communities. They are a member of Migration Working Group. It's a coalition of NGOs that work on the protection and rights of non-citizens in Malaysia. For the past 10 years, I was the Assistant Director at the Bar Council of Malaysia, and that's where my work on refugees and migrants started. And basically, I do mostly cases on detention, for immigration detention offences and also criminal offences, also on labour offences, violations, and trafficking cases. We have about 150,000 refugees and asylum seekers in Malaysia, 95% of whom are from Myanmar. So Malaysia is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, and refugees are allowed to live in Malaysia on a humanitarian ground, where the UNHCR facilitates the refugee status determination process. We do not have a comprehensive framework on refugees, so all the policies that the government meets out on refugees and non-citizens are on an ad hoc basis. So we work around those kind of policies and find solutions to facilitate the lives of the refugees in the country.
Good afternoon. So I'm Bruno, and I'm a paralegal and research officer for Daly Ho and Associates. Daly Ho and Associates is a firm led by Mark Daly and Patricia Ho, who are human rights lawyers in Hong Kong. And we are a specialized firm working in the areas of public law, human rights, ethnic minorities, and human trafficking. We have extensive experience in representing refugee and asylum seekers seeking protection in Hong Kong, in judicial review proceedings, detention damages proceedings, and right to work. Our office is like a small United Nations because we have 9 different nationalities within the office currently. So we have Sri Lankan lawyer, American lawyer, Canadian lawyer, Hong Kong lawyer, Vietnamese lawyer, and me, from France. So the main challenge that we face in Hong Kong right now, it's first that Hong Kong is not part of the Refugee Convention, and refugee and asylum seekers are screened under what we call the USM, which is a United Scheme Mechanism. And it's a government system. So the screening is under several rights. So first, Hong Kong is part of the Convention Against Torture, and refugee and asylum seekers are also screened under persecution risk and Bill of Rights of the Hong Kong Bill of Rights. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mohammed Farhat. I'm an Egyptian lawyer and I'm working as program director at the Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights. The Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights, FRR, the Egyptian national organization, is founded 2008. And the reason behind the Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights is that since that time in Egypt there is no any organizations composed from nationals provided service for refugees. So a group of lawyers, one of them is here, Mr. Mohammed Bayoumi, he decided with other colleagues to found to establish the organization to provide the legal assistance for refugees. And also the main reason behind establishing the organization that to fill the gap. Before 2008, there is no any organization in Egypt represent the refugees before the courts and in the litigation process. Before 2008, only the legal assistance is limited to represent the refugees before UNHCR. But if the refugees face any crime problems, or he have to show up before the courts. So the legal representation is 100% is absent. This is the main reason behind the subject of IRR. About the legal background in Egypt, we don't have a domestic law to control the refugee issues. Although Egypt is part of many international human rights conventions, and also in 1951 convention related to the refugees, but we still have many challenges to apply this international convention before the international courts. Yes. Thank you.
So following up on that, something you said, Mohammed, and I mean, I guess one of the issues that faces refugees in these jurisdictions is the lack of legal services. You know, the inability to access legal services. And you mentioned kind of in a moment ago, kind of starting the Egyptian Foundation. And I guess the question is, I mean, what are the challenges of starting a new legal aid organization? What challenges has EFRR faced as a new legal aid organization in Egypt?
As I mentioned, the most important challenge we face is that the lack of national law organized situation of refugees, because we have international organizations, international conventions, and we part on this. But the problem is the applicable of this convention before the courts. Unfortunately, most of us is not convinced to apply the international convention. And when we argue using this international convention, we ask about where is the national laws. This is a problem. And the second problem is now in all international governmental institutions, they apply some of laws related to foreigners. Of course, it's not fit with the situation and the position of refugees.
And Hamza, you also talked about kind of being pioneers in India, being the only organization. What challenges have you faced as a young organization?
I can't think of what challenges we haven't faced. So starting out was obviously was tough because nobody else had done this before. Nobody else had thought of giving legal representation to asylum seekers before UNHCR, although it's a part of UNHCR's own procedural code that they are entitled to representation. But given that there is no law on refugees in India, we haven't signed the convention, and UNHCR itself works. It works in a sort of vacuum because their mandate is very limited in terms of the nationalities that they can work with. And also they only follow international law guidelines since there are no domestic ones to follow. So getting an Indian organization into that space was not entirely welcomed to start. We had to fight a bit of a battle there and go to headquarters, and they had to okay it for us to even sort of start giving representation. But to be fair, after that, it wasn't that bad as far as actually going to UNHCR and giving that representation goes. But each time we want to sort of advocate with them for a more transparent process. Things that are done as of, a standard procedure in other jurisdictions, we have to actually ask them and negotiate with them. Things like getting reasons for rejection, or getting someone to allow sort of representation in the room while an asylum seeker is being interviewed. So each thing is a new separate challenge. Secondly, like I said, we work in a legal black hole. There are no laws. So sometimes that works to our favor because we can manipulate whatever there is to the refugees' benefit. But very often there is nothing to manipulate. So you're sort of just grasping at straws, which doesn't always get you anywhere. And then there is although we can get them refugee status as per UNHCR's laws, they can't go anywhere from there because obviously UNHCR is not running India. So it's not like they can go with a UNHCR card and get accommodation or get health or education. So all of those are separate battles that we have to fight at every stage for each individual case because there's no institutionalized mechanism for getting those things. And technically UNHCR is supposed to be doing the advocacy for that, but they have a lot of political constraints. So if they sort of overreach and decide to advocate to the government for something that is too controversial to the government or even for UNHCR, they risk being thrown out of the country. So you have to sort of tread on eggshells a little bit for everything. That's really the biggest challenge. You have to be careful. You can get things done, but you have to be very careful and you have to maneuver your way around and have a very clear strategy for where you're going, because otherwise you do get thrown off. And as an organization, I think our biggest challenge is funding. There is no domestic funding whatsoever for any kind of refugee work. Even the easier things, so-called easier things, like getting education for women and children, where there is never any political sort of controversy, is hard in India, because when you talk about refugee women and children being vulnerable, the donor's argument inside India would always be, but Indian women and children are no less vulnerable, because I keep saying this, but I can't say it enough. In a country with 1.2 billion people, there are lots of people at risk. There are lots of nationals at risk. And representing the interests of a very small, almost invisible population is a very big challenge, because nobody really wants to devote time or resources, money really, to that. So domestic funding is almost a no-go area for us. We have to rely on international funders. And then when it comes to international funders, it sounds like a big list of complaints, but it really is actually. So when it comes to international funding, we have to work harder to attract international funding to India, because on the face of it, India is a democracy. The government is humanitarian. And we have such things as fundamental rights and equal rights. So it's very hard to say that refugees are a marginalized population in India. And also there are bigger population of refugees in other countries. I mean, if you look, even in the region, Pakistan has 6 times the amount of refugees that India has. So it would be more cost effective for a donor to divert funding to Pakistan rather than to India. So yeah, it's an uphill battle. We have to apply for funding each year and have a celebratory dinner each time we get funding. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I guess, working as refugee lawyers in these regions is kind of following a bit of a uncharted path. And so I guess a question that comes up that I'll turn to you, Sumi, for is how did you become a refugee lawyer in the first place? Would you even use that word to describe yourself? And when did you start and why?
Okay, it's a flashback question. I was forced into this work, really. When I was working in the Bar Council, I was doing other work. It was IP law, employment law and all that. But then one of my superiors came and said, okay, now I think you need to do this work, this refugee and migrant work. And like many Malaysians, I had no idea who these people were. And I was thinking, like, why am I advocating or why am I going to do this work when I don't know anything about this area of law? And he said, no, I think you should take on this work and see how it goes. So I held the committee that was doing that work, for about 3 months. And in that 3 months, I learned about the community, how they lived in Malaysia, and the vulnerabilities they faced and all. And thereafter, the same superior came back to me and said, okay, do you want to continue the work? And I said, just give me another 3 more months and I will see whether I would like to continue this work. And 10 years, I was still holding that committee. So what I think struck me in that particular issue was the fact that these people were very vulnerable. They came to a country, it was like they were vulnerable back home. And they were hoping for a better life in Malaysia. But when they came to Malaysia, it was a little more other challenges that they had to face. And I found that there was a lack of lawyers and advocacy on this matter, in these issues. So this is why I thought, okay, I think I really need to do something about this. And this is how I got into this work.
And Hamza, I think you have an interesting story about how you became a refugee lawyer too.
I'm not sure how interesting it is, but I also fell into it. I think it's going to be, I'm not sure how many people you're going to encourage by saying we all fell into this line of work, but so I was doing my master's in France, and then I went to Brussels for an internship at the European Parliament. And I happened to be placed with the Committee on Liberty and Justice, which works on issues of immigration as well. And I was attending a meeting, or I was going to attend a meeting once in the committee as an intern. So no big fancy thing there. But just sitting in a meeting, and there was an agenda over there for the meeting, which had a list of NGOs on the back that work on refugee law all over Europe. So there was one in London that caught my eye. It was called Bail for Immigration Detainees. And I thought lawyer, bail, very simple line of thinking. So I made my way to London and asked for an internship there. And they gave it to me, mostly because I spoke Hindi and Tamil, which a lot of refugees speak, Pakistanis, as well as Sri Lankans, a lot of asylum seekers who tend to be in detention in the UK, actually. So this NGO basically had a helpline where they called up people, or people in detention could call them and ask them for help to apply for bail to get out of detention. And after that, I think I just got interested in refugee law. So I wasn't forced into it, but I sort of, I found my way to it, into it by accident.
So for those of you who wandered into this room by mistake and are trying to figure out kind of an opportune moment to leave, this could be your random moment that changes your life. So, I mean, I guess the question is, what is it that refugee lawyers do? So maybe I can turn to you, Bruno. I mean, what kind of cases does your firm take up? I mean, what kind of cases are you working on these days?
So, when I can maybe just talk about one of the challenges and that will explain why we are doing this kind of work. Because in Hong Kong, under the USM, there is no public decision. Immigration and torture claim appeal board decisions are not public, which is if we want this decision be scrutinized and public, we need to bring them in high court by way of judicial review. So right now, mainly our firm work with judicial review proceedings. We also handle a lot of detention damages cases, ethnic minorities cases, and we also right now launch several proceedings in human trafficking issue. And our lawyer, so the 3 associates and the 2 partners are on the duty lawyer panel, so they work with refugees through the duty lawyer service.
And how about you, Hamza? What cases are you working on? Well, what does a refugee lawyer do at IRA Trust these days?
So like I said, we do a lot of legal representation before UNHCR. Which is basically arguing why an asylum seeker should be accepted as a refugee before UNHCR, which is where they have to go for status determination. Right now, we have a lot of UNHCR is rejecting a lot of cases now. So we have a lot more appeals than we've seen in the last 5 years, really. And appeals are also getting rejected, which doesn't speak very well for our organization because suddenly our acceptance rate has really gone down. But that sort of reflects a general trend in the world, I think. We have also recently become involved in in the litigation that Martin mentioned, actually, which is 2 Rohingyas have challenged a deportation order issued by the Indian government for all Rohingyas before the Supreme Court of India. So the Indian government issued this order without really thinking about how they were going to deport a bunch of stateless people to a country that wasn't willing to have them. So the case hasn't actually gone anywhere in court, but the IRA Trust was involved in drafting the petitions, and we're still involved in all the legal documentation and the research. So the case, like I said, it hasn't gone anywhere in court, and we don't think it's going to go anywhere because the government seems to have sort of locked itself into a corner by issuing an order that didn't have a legal basis. So that's interesting. But other than that, we have a lot of core asylum cases where we have to rely on UNHCR guidelines and largely international law.
So turning to you, Mohammed, can you tell me a bit about how, I mean, as kind of the first organization in Egypt arguing these types of cases before Egyptian courts, I mean, how do judges react when you show up in court representing a refugee, when you make arguments based upon refugee law broadly construed? What's that conversation like with the judiciary?
Okay, to answer this question, let me first differentiate between the judicial systems working in Egypt, because the situation is different from which judicial body we show before. So if we speak about the civil courts or criminal courts, so in this time, we face a problem to convince the judges to use or to apply the international conventions. And as I mentioned before, they asked about the national laws. And we as a judges, Egyptian judges or national judges, we only apply the national laws. But if we speak about the administrative courts, in this time the react and the negotiation with the judges be more useful because they adopted our argument, especially in the 1950 Convention, and also in some cases, especially related to the detention and deportation, we discovered that when the court issued the final decision that they put another provisions from international human rights conventions, and since we start our work, I think we deal with more 50 deportation cases, and most of them, not all, but most of them, as we managed to get a final decision by stop the deportation order and release the refugees from the courts. But still, we have a problem with the criminal courts, especially, and military courts, especially for this person enter Egypt illegally.
I think, as with many areas of law, a lot of the real work of, not a lot of the real work, but I mean, a lot of the work of lawyers, refugee lawyers included, happens outside of the courtroom, maybe outside of formal litigation processes. I mean, in these kind of jurisdictions, how can lawyers use legal arguments to help refugees? And maybe Sumi, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's true that taking your case to the court should be, for refugee issues, is the last resort, really. We do other initiatives with the government. Example, we do a lot of advocacy with the government on policy making. Most importantly, the Bar Council has a pupillage, legal aid pupillage with the UNHCR, where students who are, pupils who are pursuing their chambering will attend 2 weeks of legal aid, mandatory legal aid with the UNHCR to work with the UNHCR on refugee issues. And then we also have collaborations with the universities. We have a legal aid clinic running with the universities where they provide legal aid for refugees, migrants, and anyone who comes to them. So there's a duty legal advisor at the university that helps the students to manage those kind of cases. In other collaborations that we have is some organizations like Asylum Access will have some sort of training for new lawyers that coming into the profession, and give them some training on refugee law, and then put them on their panel of lawyers so that they can help them with their RSD processes. So these are the few initiatives that we have in Malaysia.
And I guess, I mean, just closing out the questions kind of from me to each of you, maybe we can go back down the panel, starting with you, Mohammed. And I guess the question is a general one, but it's a forward-looking one. I mean, we've heard a little bit about the practice, about some of your histories, your organization's histories, personal histories. But what's the future? What's the future of refugee law in each of your jurisdictions? I mean, what in the next year, in the next 2 years, I mean, what do you expect to be happening? What do you hope to be happening? What are you trying to make happen?
Okay. So I was past 10 years, we realized that in Egypt, if we speak about the protection for refugees to be more secure, so we need to adopt national refugee laws to secure that when we represent any refugees before the courts or before a governmental institution, we can say that we have a national law, and we have this argument according to the national law. So we realize that we are in Egypt really need to adopt the national law. So 3 years ago, within FRR, we start to work and draft a national law, and we have many of meetings with national experts and international experts to draft this law. 2 months ago, we have 3 meetings with national organization working different sectors in human rights. And finally, we can say that we reached to the pre-final draft. But the problem now, we have the presidential election will be running after 2 months. So after the election, we will start to communicate with political parties and another international organization and national organization working in Egypt to adopt this law, and it's submitted to Parliament. And before that, also we work in parallel steps to adopt something like the policy paper to prove that to the Egyptian to the decision maker that the need of the national laws is very needed to the refugees. So we need to pave the way before we submit the draft to the parliament. So, or you can say that to raise awareness between the politician and the other actors that we need to adopt this to solve these challenges and to protect refugees in Egypt. Thank you. Thanks.
So for Hong Kong, the main expectation, it's a bit difficult for us to have a clear view of what will happen in 1 and 2 years. But what we can say right now, it's we hope that the rule of law in Hong Kong will stay strong, which is not absolutely clear right now, as you can all see in reading the news and reading everything happen in Hong Kong right now. But we truly believe that how big chances to have a strong and independent high court who can scrutinize and give some sort of guidance for immigration when they're screening refugee cases. And the second thing that I can maybe bring, and which overlap a bit what I was just saying about the rule of law, it's a cut down with legal aid. Right now, and this is a public figure, we observe that in 2014, the acceptance rate for legal aid was 53%. Last year, that was only 6%, which obliged a firm like our firm to do a lot of cases on a pro bono basis. And we can say that there is not a lot of firms who are willing to take a judicial review on the pro bono basis right now. Thank you.
For Malaysia, I think we have seen quite a bit of development in Malaysia in terms of refugee rights. Example, right to health. Now we have insurance companies giving insurance policies to refugees, something that was not heard of before. We also have international companies providing work rights or work opportunities to refugees so that they can earn a living in the formal sector. In terms of schools, we also have funders coming in to help NGOs and communities in Malaysia to run schools for refugee children. There was a time when the Malaysian government never allowed such schools to run, to operate, but now the Malaysian government is okay for them to run such schools. The refugee children are not allowed into public schools, but then they can attend NGO and community schools, so that's quite a bit of a development there. Finally, I think over the few years, especially on the Rohingya issues, the Malaysia has taken a very forward step and has been speaking for the community in terms of their protection and trying to negotiate some durable solution with the Myanmar government. So that's all quite a good positive step forward, because also I think the number of refugees that we have in our country has increased. And so the government is realizing that they have to do something, that the government has to do something rather than the private actors or the NGOs or the community themselves. So they've taken a lot of proactive steps in that direction, and I think we see that this is going to increase more in the near future, and hopefully refugees that are in the country can have more durable solutions, not only to go back to their country, maybe to integrate within our society as well, or even a resettlement.
So for refugee law, I want to say there's no way to go but up. We don't have a law right now. We haven't signed the convention. We have a case pending in court. So nothing bad can happen now, I think. We do have some legislation pending in Parliament, which is a good thing. So we have a draft of an asylum bill in Parliament, which is as far as it's ever gone so far. So if something comes out of that, well and good. If not, at least there has been some kind of public discourse, and people know about refugees now, which is a big step in India. Nobody even knew they existed till 5 years back or 2 years back even. As far as the litigation in court goes, I'm not sure we really want a sort of judgment on that. We think the court is kind of postponing it again and again because they don't want to antagonize the government, which is a positive sign in that they are probably leaning towards antagonizing the government if they were to go by the law, because there's really no legal basis for deportation. So even if nothing comes out of that, again, it's in the papers, it's in the courts, people know about it, and that's a good thing in India. In a country where nobody knows about refugees, any attention right now is good. For refugees, having said that, for refugees, I'm not sure it's all good. It's a very politically charged situation right now. The government has been, in spite of not having any kind of legal basis to say these things, the government has been going out and talking about how they are, clogging the system and how they are here all as illegal immigrants, none of which is good. So although so far the government has been generous in terms of providing access to health and education at least, we are afraid that they may restrict that access in future if they continue to go the way that they're going now. But again, there's no way saying which way the cookie is going to crumble in India, really. It's a very political situation. We just have to hope for the government to change.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, those are my questions for you, but now why don't we throw it open to questions or comments from the floor.
Start because I'll forget what I was going to say. So no, there's not much awareness in India. In the last 6 months, there has been some coverage in the papers because a lot of Rohingyas have come into India following violence in Rakhine State in August 2017, which is really very recent. So coverage in the papers has been largely positive. Because obviously they came in a very bad situation, and so the coverage has been humanitarian from that perspective. So there is some public sympathy for them. There are always people who have a narrower view of things, but that can't be helped. But as far as what can be done to improve that perception, UNHCR, like I said, is mildly paranoid about going out and sort of putting itself out there and saying we are UNHCR and this is what we do. So they're not very proactive when it comes to generating public information material right now. NGOs, which is mostly us, because all the other NGOs that work with refugees work with UNHCR. So we are trying to launch a few information materials for the public. So very basic things on who refugees are, which countries they come from, how they are different from economic migrants, and why people don't need to worry about them. We are doing a little bit of that, and then we have a very small nascent livelihood project right now, which focuses on Afghan embroidery so that we can put products out there and sort of sensitize them towards the cultural aspects of refugee assimilation into India rather than concentrating on the political aspect of it for now. Because I don't think the concern in India is, there are these extra small number of 200,000 people that we need to take care of. It's more like a cultural thing. People need to be aware that these people are different. There's a little bit of racism when it comes to African refugees, for example. So more to combat that, really.
I think if you asked me 10 years ago whether there was any awareness in Malaysia, I don't think there would be. But over the 10 years that we have started this work and with other organizations as well, we have done a lot of advocacy in the sense that we have reached out to universities and colleges, to students, giving them talks about refugees, bringing the refugee community into schools and universities to tell them that here we are and this is what we want and this is how we're living in Malaysia. More importantly, we have reached out a lot to the MPs, the members of parliament, because their statements really carry weight. So we have found allies within the member of parliaments, we have found allies in media as well, the mainstream media, alternative medias, whoever can actually bring our story out to the public. So now you can actually see that people know there are refugees in the country. They know who they are, where they are from, and I think that's a positive development. So I wouldn't say that there is no awareness. Now everybody knows there's refugees in the country and who they are. So I think it's good. Yeah.
I think for Hong Kong, if you all read the news, you can see that the image of refugee in Hong Kong is quite bad right now, because the only thing that we heard is like there are migrants, economic migrants, they are here for economic reasons. So it's a bit difficult actually in Hong Kong, because it's more changing the opinion of the majority about what is a refugee and why they come here. So it's one of the solutions would be maybe to share more positive story, because we always talk about the struggle of refugee and why they are here, that they fled the war. It looks like every time a very sad story, but actually there is some good story of people who came here, and that might be a way, but I think it's a long and tough path in Hong Kong to bring maybe more positive opinion to a refugee.
Lack of awareness is one of concerns with refugees in Egypt, because most of nationals don't know or don't have idea about the refugees, the situation of the refugees. And after the Arab Spring in Middle East, most of Egyptians now be familiar with refugees, who is refugees, but still some of nationals don't know anything about refugees. I think NGOs alone cannot fill this gap. And NGOs not only the responsible for raise awareness of the nationals about the refugees. I think all the stakeholders have to involve in this. UNHCR has a big role. Egyptian government has all governments has a role in this. Within FRR, we have a problem. We have a program, it's annual program, to meet with the journalists and the media actors and train them about the refugees law and the situation of refugees. And we ask them to make some press release about the situation. Since 2014, we have many press releases about the situation. Our journalists that trained within FRR issued 100 press releases, and they do some campaign to inform the nation about the situation of refugees. This is the role of NGOs in Egypt.
I just think when it comes to awareness, generally globalization, Facebook, the internet has helped, because at least everybody knows that there is such a thing as refugees now around the world. I think all the images that we've seen of Syria or of Yemen, Rohingyas a lot in the last few months, I think generally the awareness levels are a little bit higher now, or getting there at least, which is a good thing.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that's the depressing reality. We have more refugees in the world today than we've ever had. Than certainly since the end of the Second World War. That means that the public generally are more aware of refugees. The real challenge is, as you kind of point out in the background of your question, which is getting them aware that refugees are here. And I remember when I first went to Malaysia and you talked to people about refugees, and thankfully it's a bit different now. But the archetype there in the public imagination was of the Indo-Chinese refugees. And so you'd say, I work with refugees. And they'd say, oh, we don't have any more refugees. The camps are closed. The islands are closed. There's this imagination of refugees as being somewhere else. And the reality in each of these countries, and of the world for that matter, is that refugees, the majority of the world's refugees are no longer in refugee camps on borders in remote places. They're urban refugees. They're in places like Hong Kong, in places like Cairo and Kuala Lumpur, and in places like Delhi. They're in big cities. But it's getting the public's imagination to catch up with that reality, I think, which is the big challenge. Yeah. Another question.
I assume that trafficked victims would be classified as refugees in many cases. And my understanding, going back to something like 2003-4 in Hong Kong, was that the government was very reluctant, the police were very reluctant to accord trafficked victims any recognition. There was no trafficking in Hong Kong. This was what we were told. And I wonder whether that has changed. I'm not aware of it changing. And I'm thinking particularly of organized crime, bringing women in, nowadays from Africa, as well as from South Asia, and of course as well as from the mainland, though perhaps that is lessening a bit because, perhaps that is lessening a bit. But certainly women who were brought in and were given to understand that they would have a role as a waitress or dancing, and then found that this was actually not the job they were being offered. They end up here illegally pursuing a sex career. Now, what is the Hong Kong government's take on the trafficking as an issue? Thank you.
Well, sadly, the answer will be short. There is no improvement right now on the human trafficking side. And it's even worse than that. We have this ongoing law case, which is, the court of first instance the judge recognized that there is some missing part in the legal framework to protect human trafficking victims. But the Hong Kong government appealed this decision right now. So I think this is a clear answer from the Hong Kong government on that topic.
It's an interesting question also to the extent that it raises this question of the overlap between victims of trafficking and refugees. And you're right to point out that victims of trafficking often can get protection as refugees. And the interesting thing about some of these jurisdictions is even though they don't have refugee laws necessarily, I mean, many of them actually do have anti-trafficking laws, I mean, which can be flawed in many, many ways. But I mean, some of the advocacy around refugees in each of these countries, I mean, has also used languages and attention that's given to victims of trafficking to try and bring protection effectively for refugees through that opening because of the international pressure and discourses around trafficking. Yeah, there was another question at the back there. Yeah, yeah.
It takes about 2 years for you to get an appointment for your RSD with the UNHCR. In the meantime, you'll have an appointment letter. Even if you have an appointment letter or if you have a refugee card, you're not allowed to work in Malaysia at all because you are deemed an illegal immigrant, so you're not allowed to work. Definitely, you're not allowed Social Security. That's only accorded to Malaysians actually. Even migrants do not have Social Security in Malaysia. So so you can't work, but then how else can refugees keep body and soul together if you do not work and earn a living? So they do work in the informal sector under the radar. So we have cases where the employers are detained for allowing a refugee to work in their premises. So those cases we do not publicize because we do not want to instill fear in other employers so that they don't get fearful of employing a refugee. So those cases we take on and we try to do it under the radar without publicizing those cases. But very far in between we have such cases. Most of the time it is the bigger companies that allow refugees to work within their premises, like example IKEA. And we have other industries who take on refugees to work in their premises. But the only condition is that they work at the back end. So they are not really the receptionist, or they don't work on sales, Most of the time they'll work in the stores at the back end, so that they are away from the public eye, so that they don't get reported. Yeah. Other than that, I think the smaller industries, maybe agricultural, they work in agricultural sectors as well, and also the service industry, but always in the back end.
I think the situation in Egypt is more critical in this related to the right to work and social welfare, because the problem is the Egyptian government treated refugees as foreigners, especially in concern of work. So all refugees needed to get work permit before to start the work. The problem is not to getting the permit, but the condition and the requirements to get this. Most of these requirements should be fulfilled before you enter the Egypt, and you have to come to Egypt to work. So if we apply this in refugees, that means it's possible for any refugees to get the work permit. This is the like situation, but most of refugees, especially the Syrian refugees, is working in informal sector, and we can say that the Egyptian government don't make a problem for them and let them work. For social welfare, unfortunately, Egypt made a reservation when the Egyptian government signed the 1950 Convention Egypt declared that will not apply the provision related to social welfare for refugees. This situation in Egypt.
So before I just speak about the right to work, we need to keep one thing in mind in Hong Kong. If, and I say if, it's a big if because the acceptance rate is very low, but if you have a successful case, that doesn't mean you will become a Hong Kong citizen. You are just waiting for resettlement. So for these particular cases, they have the right to work. Pending the resettlement, they need to renew this permission. It's a permission and not a visa, which is completely different. And they need to renew this permission every 6 months. So, but that only concerns successful cases who are waiting for resettlement. For the other refugees who are here, they mainly rely on ISS allowance. The government provides a small amount for renting, but I think, if I'm not wrong, it's like 1,000 Hong Kong dollar or 2,000 Hong Kong dollar, which is ridiculously low if you look at the renting price in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong government provide as well food coupon for refugees who can go to some supermarket, and I think it's like 900 Hong Kong dollar per month. So this is the only allowance that they have. After that, we have some NGO who work a lot with refugees and who help a lot the refugee for this.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. They don't have access to social security because India doesn't have a lot of social security, basically. So they have some schemes for people who are so-called below poverty line populations, which is restricted to citizens. So that's rations, and mostly ration, really. They have access to government healthcare and government schools, mostly in Delhi, because outside of Delhi, no one's aware of refugees or of the UNHCR card, so they can't access these things. So if they are in Delhi, then they can access government hospitals and schools. Employment, it's pretty much like in Malaysia. The government sort of turns a blind eye, largely. They don't actively go after people who employ refugees, but they don't give permission to work. There was a brief period for which they issued something called a long-term visa, which had an implied right to work with it, but they've stopped issuing those now. So the LTV was issued on the basis of the UNHCR refugee card. The government's not issuing them anymore, so we don't know what their position is on the right to work. But they allow refugees to work in the informal sector without documentation and without really going after them. So that's the best case scenario. If there's a refugee who's better qualified, who wants a job as a nurse or a doctor or a teacher, I don't know how far they'd get in India, because also there's a lot of local competition in the job market. We always have to remember the 1.2 billion figure. There's people, clawing at the system for everything. There are always better qualified Indians for any job in India and even outside of India, I think. So it's very hard for a refugee to go with a foreign qualification. A qualification acquired outside of India, not necessarily in English, and say, I want to work in this hospital or this school or this, IT firm. It's very hard to get a job, really. So they end up in sweatshops or in really sort of underground jobs. It's very bleak, is what I want to say.
I think what you're hearing is even if somebody is recognized as a refugee in each of these jurisdictions, it's both very difficult for them to get the right to work and then very difficult for them to use that right to work to get formal employment because of the various barriers that have been talked about. And that, I think probably in all of these places, the long-term visa regime, certainly the residency permit regimes in Egypt, the answer to that question also varies a bit at every particular moment. Policies have changed quite quickly on this, but also with respect to different countries of nationality of refugees. So in Egypt, the Syrian refugees are treated differently than other refugees. In India, the individuals who had access to the long-term visas are treated differently than those who didn't. There's still an interesting set of legal questions that go beyond and deeper than the right to work, because as you've heard, refugees do work because they have pretty much no choice. How are you supposed to survive on, even in Hong Kong where there is government support, how are you supposed to survive on that? Especially if you have a family to support either here or back home. And so the reality is that people do work, and then the legal question becomes, what are their rights when they do work illegally? And what happens when they get injured on the job? Do they qualify for workplace compensation schemes? What happens if their employer doesn't pay them for the work that they actually do? And I think there's been interesting litigation in each of these jurisdictions around that. So, the right to work is a really important question to ask. It's a very complicated answer, but it's the start of a series of questions about kind of economic self-sufficiency that probably goes deeper and actually in some ways presents other opportunities. So even if we can't get refugees a right to work, can we get them some basic workplace protections so that when they do work, they have some ability to claim some basic rights if they're mistreated or injured?
Okay, so I will reply in 2 times to your question. First, when I say the low acceptance rates, it's because for refugee, it's under 1% right now. So there is less than 1% of refugees who are recognized as a refugee in Hong Kong. About legal aid, I think this cut down, of course, affect Hong Kong citizens as well, for proceedings who involve Hong Kong citizens, but it looks like it's mostly involve refugee case and USM challenge. But we don't have a precise figure, so we cannot say clearly if it's only for refugee or if it's for everybody, but of course this could then affect Hong Kong citizens as well. And at last, for your last question, I just will repeat what I said. In Hong Kong, refugees, even if they are recognized as a refugee, cannot stay in Hong Kong. So they all end up at one point in another country. They are resettled somewhere else. So Hong Kong is we can say is a step for them, but it's not the final destination. In any event, they cannot stay here. The thing is, the answer for the right to work go with low acceptance rates, as you have only less than 1% of refugees who are recognized as a refugee. Actually, right now, I can give you some figure. There is less than 20 refugees who can work in Hong Kong right now. So this is a very, very, very small number, and this is a very small number.
I would just like to supplement the Bruno's statement, because as a practitioner myself, I've dealt with refugee cases before in Hong Kong. Basically, the situation is very harsh here. For people who are pending the determination under the USM system, they cannot work whether paid or unpaid. I mention again, whether paid or unpaid. That means even they volunteer to work and just to return for a bowl of food, they cannot do so. So the situation is quite dire at the moment. And just to supplement on the particular rate that they receive from the ISS, I think it's 1,500 Hong Kong dollars per person. And for children, it's half of that. So there's also a cap for that as well. So basically, those people with genuine need and genuine requirement to have them determined as refugee, they're being put in a very difficult position here in Hong Kong. And if they cannot support themselves, they will have to go. They will have to give up eventually. This is something I would like to supplement to the audience from a practitioner's point of view.
I also like to supplement this gentleman's response in response to the first gentleman's question, but he has left. So I'm Annie from Justice Centre Hong Kong. We are an NGO that also provides legal support to asylum seekers and refugees here. So in terms of legal aid, there is indeed a decrease in the number of legal aid certificates granted to everyone in Hong Kong, not just asylum seekers and refugees. So there's a discussion last year about, I think, July or June, in the panel on the administration of justice and legal services in the Legislative Council, the Parliament in Hong Kong. So the government had a paper talking about misuse, so-called misuse of legal aid without any rigorous evidence. And in the table of the number of legal aid applications they've received and the number of legal aid certificates granted, they categorized the numbers into asylum seekers and others without any explanation. And that's the only time in the paper the term asylum seekers appeared. So it seems they're implying that there's misuse of legal aid by asylum seekers by showing the decreasing number of certificates granted. We don't know because there's basically no explanation whatsoever in the paper. But there's a real danger that because, as Bruno has said, there's some very racist discourse in Hong Kong, bad image of refugees and asylum seekers. There's a real danger that these people are criticized for misusing, abusing the legal aid system. And this is used as an excuse to advocate for limiting legal aid to the general public, including asylum seekers and refugees in Hong Kong, which can undermine the rule of law, which Bruno has raised at the beginning. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to get your opinion on maybe some of the strategies you have employed, either in engaging with government officials in your home countries or in the countries in which you work, about advocating for increased rights or protection for refugees, and what hasn't been effective, given that resettlement is not possible for the vast majority of refugees in countries that either have not signed the convention or have reserved portions of the convention that restrict key rights. and the fact that these countries have massive domestic populations with people who are also very poor and who need support in various services. How do you make a convincing argument to a government that this population of non-nationals needs increased rights and support? And have you found any of these arguments to be effective?
It's a tricky question, Yeah, I think a lot of people come back to us and say that, the Malaysian population, there's a lot of who are poor. Why don't you do some work for them rather than doing work for refugees? We get that a lot. But then again, our counter argument would be that we have schemes in Malaysia that helps the poor. We have government schemes, we have private schemes that Malaysians can access. Malaysians can access work, healthcare for free, and all that, which the non-citizens cannot, really. And one of the good examples that I can give you was when we did Right to Health. There was a time when refugees or non-citizens, undocumented non-citizens, were not allowed access to public health. They were not allowed access at all. They had to go to private institutions. So what we brought about the argument was that when we had communicable diseases, example when there was malaria or typhoid or even the flu, I can't remember what it was at that time, yeah. And also they had tuberculosis, that's all communicable diseases. And we put the argument to the government that if you did not allow this population to access medical health, then no matter how much you try to give the vaccination or protection to the Malaysians, these Malaysians are still going to be vulnerable to such diseases because the refugees and the non-citizens live among us. They live with us, they work with us, we eat at the same shop, they produce our food, and all that. So these were the arguments that we put forth for Right to Health and said that you need to protect these communities so that you can protect the whole population, really. And in terms of example on education for children, of course until now they don't allow children into public schools, but we were advocating that the government allow private institutions and private communities, the communities themselves, to set up their own schools. Because we put in the argument that you are going to create a generation of uneducated persons, which is very, 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 very dangerous for the population at large, and also it will create a lot of social problems. So although they do not allow them into the national schools, they allow these schools which are not licensed, which are not, not within the purview of the Ministry of Education to operate with private funding and also under the purview of the UNHCR and other organizations. So that is how we have to, there are a lot of arguments that you can put forth. It's just that who you're going to put it to and how you're going to present your case is very important. I would say that we use a lot of the nationalistic views because that's what resonates with the government. If we start talking about international human rights and all that in Malaysia, it really doesn't resonate with them too much. But when you talk about how it's going to affect with the other Malaysians, then they will take note and they'll do something about it. Yeah.
I think we have the same strategy. You have to make them see the benefit of sort of accepting this population or giving them access to anything, really. I just want to issue a disclaimer. Martin mentioned the state of UNHCR before. That's really, it's a reality because UNHCR tends to be quite proprietorial in its treatment of refugees within its mandate. So it's very hard to do advocacy with the government in a country where UNHCR has a presence without taking UNHCR into confidence or without sort of having their blessing. So UNHCR largely is the institution responsible for this advocacy. So it's harder for smaller NGOs to kind of approach the government directly. Especially in India, I mean, the government is like, it's like a dinosaur. It's everywhere, and it's huge, and they control a lot. So healthcare, education, everything comes under the government's mandate. What private entities give out also comes obviously under. It's very regulated, but even so, the way to advocate with the government is to make them see how not giving access to refugees would be more of a disadvantage. So when it comes to, an example is having a refugee law in India. The government's argument has always been, why have a refugee law? The population is small. Why should we bother to even sort of have a law just exclusively for them? They have laws on things like adulteration in food substances, which was a very big problem earlier, but is not so much now. But they have time to sort of legislate. So it's not a paucity of time as such. But they just don't want to bother with certain issues, and refugees is one of those issues. But so the argument we have taken so far is you should know who's on your territory. And if you have a refugee law which sort of registers refugees as they come in, you would know, you would have control over that population. So although it's a bit of a twisted argument, because it's encouraging surveillance, it's better than the alternative, which is to go after them after they're here and call them illegal. And it's the same for education or health. Or we're doing a project on financial inclusion now, and the Indian government can't very big on financial inclusion and sort of going cashless and not having an underground economy. So our argument, the line that we've taken is let them have access to banks so that you know where the money is being held in your country. Instead of people holding it, in their purse, they hold it in an institution where you have control over the money, really. It's really that, just giving them control.
In Egypt, there is many strategies depend on the organizations that adopt this strategy. With FRR as implementing better with UNHCR, so we have the strategies. This one adopted within FRR and other adopted with other service provider and UNHCR. I think the last year is that there is advocacy with UNHCR about the right to work and the residence permit. We success to reach our voice to the president about some specific problems related to, especially for the residence permit system. And also the UNHCR through the service provider and the discussions between this monthly discussion between the UNHCR and service providers, we managed also to advise the Egyptian government to sign MOU with the UNHCR to provide or to treat the refugees as a national for education and for health treatment. So now in Egypt, all the refugees treated as national. If they can go to the government hospitals, they can also have access to the governmental schools. And also in the same, there is some communities, a few communities from refugees has a right to establish their own schools and use their special curriculum for the study. And also within for FRR, we use the strategic litigation as one of our strategy to try to solve the problems, or especially legal problems. Like, see, we have now three cases we have brought before the courts. One related to the right to work, and one related to right to get the residence permit, because we have a problem with, especially with Iraqi nationality, because we realize that the Egyptian government sometimes treated refugees not in equal foot, especially the Iraqi now. They prohibited to grant the residence permit, even if they register with UNHCR as they recognize as refugees. They cannot get the residency. So there is a case before the court to challenge this policy. I think this is most. And also, there is a new strategy that will be adopted by UNHCR through 2018, and we still plan for this strategy. Just there is a meeting will be coming next week to discuss the plan and to have the steps for the new strategy. Thank you.
For Hong Kong, I think I can say that advocacy in general is very difficult in Hong Kong, and not only for refugees. And there is a lot of issue concern Hong Kong citizens first, and people try to advocate with LegCo about this, and it's very difficult for them. And there is many examples like house policy, like poverty, children's rights, and ethnic minorities in Hong Kong. So I think if it's already difficult for Hong Kong citizens to obtain something from Hong Kong government, it's even harder for refugees to do some kind of advocacy. So there is a way to speak with LegCo member, to speak with Hong Kong government, but it's very difficult for them maybe to listen and understand and take some action on this.
I guess just to put a slightly more positive spin on some of the bleak stories of difficulty of advocacy you just heard, I suppose, one of the things I think that comes out of what everybody has said is, it's a question of reframing refugee issues. It's a question of, traditionally refugee issues will be dealt with by public security, they'd be dealt with by Home Affairs, they'd be dealt with by kind of Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And some of the examples that you've heard suggest that really part of the way forward in advocacy is engaging other domains of the state, right? Whether it is the state or provincial government, the municipal government, or whether it's other ministries like the Ministry of Health or Education. And I think you've had some success in Egypt with some of that, at least. With the Ministry of Health, for example, as you've heard, being willing to talk about refugee issues because they're health issues, they're public health issues. They're not refugees, they're potentially sick people who might spread disease somewhere else. They're potentially not refugees, they're children. And the Ministry of Education is more concerned about that than they are about the refugee issue, which was a Ministry of Foreign Affairs issue. And then the other thing I think you've just heard is even in your advocacy to those different institutions within government, trying to link it to broader social interests, the social interests of, or sometimes the political interests of those institutions in preventing another outbreak of tuberculosis or slowing the spread of a particular disease, or achieving a higher literacy rate or whatever. I think in some ways, even if the legacy of some of the litigation in Hong Kong with the USM is as Bruno says, with the 1% success rate a bit mixed, some of the success in advocacy there was in linking the way refugees are treated here to bigger issues about the rule of law, which have become more and more prominent amongst more and more sectors of the population as time has passed, in pointing out that the way you treat refugees here is an indication of what potentially makes Hong Kong different, and what is special and what needs to be protected about Hong Kong. And it's that kind of reframing and explaining how refugees and how we treat refugees are linked to other interests that I think provides some opportunities, even with otherwise quite intransigent governments. Yeah. But I think we're probably now out of time, or do we have time for one more question? One more question, if there's one more question. Yeah, sure.
Hi. I'm just wondering, has there been any successful cases? I know for one, there's the CN case in Hong Kong about human trafficking, but I'm more on in general asking about how is there any successful cases in Egypt or India or Malaysia where you helped human trafficking victims to apply for non-refoulement claims in your own country for them not to be tortured, persecuted, tortured back in their country of origin. Have you been working on those cases, or is there any known successful cases in your own jurisdictions?
You're saying the the return of victims of trafficking, yeah? Is that
to their country of origin.
Okay.
When they have been trafficked to India or Malaysia.
So in India, the regime is slightly different for trafficking victims and refugees, because the government has sort of not laws, but lots of regulations on how to deal with trafficking victims. But trafficking victims in India are typically from non-refugee producing countries. So Bangladesh, Nepal, other countries around India, mostly Bangladesh and Nepal really. And the government processes those cases. So they actually have this sort of system where they focus on rehabilitation, rescue, and then rehabilitation and repatriation. So their focus is actually on sending these people back to their own countries. with a little bit of money or a little bit of vocational training or whatever they consider, rehabilitation. And these people are often happy to go back as well because they don't come from situations of persecution in their home countries. They may have been persecuted on the way to India, or tortured or gone into sexual slavery in India, but typically they want to go back to Nepal or Bangladesh or wherever they came from. When it comes to people who have been smuggled, so the Rohingyas are smuggled into India. There are lots of cases of Rohingyas being smuggled through people smugglers or traffickers or whatever you want to call them. But those cases, Rohingyas are accepted by UNHCR. They are given refugee status, so there's no question of sending them back. So they're two very different populations, really. So there's not much of a cross between them. There are some cases of the odd asylum seeker from Congo or the Ivory Coast who gets trafficked and comes into India. But I'm not sure we can claim any success with those because they have to approach UNHCR for asylum. And UNHCR may or may not accept their case depending on their backstory. So they treat it like any other case, really.
Egypt is one of the countries that has a good anti-trafficking law, but if we speak about the refugees, most of refugees, or some the victim of trafficking are refugees, or they come Egypt seek for asylum in Egypt. In Egypt, we don't have like the deportation or send the refugees back to their countries is not systematic in Egypt. So if you are the victim of trafficking, and you can come or enter to Egypt, but if you are victim of smuggling, in this time maybe Egypt government send you back to your country of origin. But not for all nationality, but in some nationality. For example, for Sudanese, if the Egyptian government arrested you and detain you in the border, when you cross the border, can send you back to the Sudan, even if you seek asylum in Egypt. If you are a Syrian, this will not happen, and the Egypt government will legalize your situation and let you get into the Egypt.
In terms of Malaysia, 96% of the traffic victims are foreign nationals. Only 4% are local Malaysians. But the trafficking laws in Malaysia do not differentiate between a victim who is a migrant and a victim who's a refugee. It treats both the groups the same. And if you're a migrant and you're a traffic victim, by and large, you will go through the court process, and then you have option of going back to your home country, or you're given the option of joining the government program to work in Malaysia, given the work permit and work in Malaysia for 3 years. But if you're a traffic victim, a refugee, then you go through the court process, you are kept in the shelter, but then thereafter you are released to the custody of UNHCR, and they will take on the process of doing your RSD and so on and so forth. So they are not sent back to the country. So that's how the trafficking laws work in Malaysia.
So just a quick answer on this as well, because I already speak about the human trafficking case here. But just in Hong Kong, human trafficking is not a grounds who can be raised under the USM system. So unless you show that because you are a victim of trafficking and you came here as a refugee and that you are at risk of persecution or torture or that your right to life is threatened, they will send you back and refuse your case. After that, of course, if you have ongoing cases in Hong Kong for human trafficking, you cannot be removed until your case is definitely closed.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. Yeah. And maybe you can join Kelly and I in thanking the panelists for everything they've said.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Martin and for bringing this amazing team together, and also all of the panelists for sharing their experiences. Clearly, the challenges that they're facing are immense, and it is certainly an uphill battle, but I think it was Hamza who said that optimistically, I think your tone was optimistic, that there's nowhere to go but up. And the sort of uncharted path, the lack of law, lack of institutionalized mechanisms that you mentioned have seemed, and you've shown evidence that they have inspired some very creative legal responses, but other types of advocacy responses. And certainly the work you're doing is incredibly impressive, and you've made quite a lot of progress given the circumstances. So please join me in thanking Martin and all of the panelists.